Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Andrew McTominay. I'm a part-time lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, and I'm here today to talk very briefly about how Leeds got its water, particularly focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, this research comes from my PhD thesis, which I completed in 2019 at Leeds Beckett, and unfortunately I don't have the time to go into all of the different themes and topics that I explored there. However, what I want to do today is provide a brief overview of how Leeds was able to secure a water supply that allowed the city to grow and flourish. So I'm going to start really in the 19th century, focusing particularly on the 1860s and 1870s, before moving into the 20th century. But first I want to provide a little bit of context. So Leeds has obviously been around for a number of centuries, so supplying water to the town was not a new problem by the turn of the 19th century. The closed Anglican corporation established to govern the town in 1626 did not directly manage water. Instead, they employed the engineer George Surrecold of Derby to establish a water network. This included small reservoirs set up across the town, as we can see on this map. There was one by the Grand Theatre on North Street, and another under what is now Starbucks, opposite the Trinity Centre on the junction of Albion Street and Commercial Street. From 1790 until 1837, the Improvement Commissioners took charge of supply. And when it became clear that the commissioners did not have the ability to manage water supply sufficiently, a private water company was established by an Act of Parliament, the Leeds Waterworks Company. Now, while, as I said, supplying water was not a new problem by the turn of the 19th century, increased industrialisation and urbanisation meant that it was a much bigger and more pressing responsibility than it had been previously. And, in fact, a large outbreak of cholera in Leeds in 1832 may also have been a factor here. The Leeds Waterworks Company was better placed to manage water supply. Under their auspices, reservoirs on Woodhouse Moor and Eccup were established. However, the sheer rate of population growth and industrial growth in Leeds in the mid-19th century meant that the Waterworks Company was not sufficiently able to manage water either. Population increased from 172,000 in 1851 to 207,000 in 1861 to 259,000 in 1871. So we're having really big jumps in population here. Among other factors, it was believed that private water companies would struggle to raise the necessary funds from Parliament needed to build large infrastructure projects, something that municipal government was much better placed to achieve. Using a handy clause from the Waterworks Company's establishment that allowed municipalisation, the Leeds Corporation brought water in-house in 1852, and water stayed under municipal control until the establishment of the regional water boards in the 1970s. Now, the corporation quickly got to work to supply fresh water to the growing town. They initially wanted to build a series of reservoirs in the Upper Wharfe Valley, but they were beaten to the punch by Bradford, who went on to build reservoirs at Barden, Silsden and Grimwith, as we can see on screen. Leeds then had to settle for the Lower Wharfe, building a pumping station at Ardington near Otley in 1854. It soon became apparent, though, that the water supply of the River Wharfe had become polluted by factories upriver from the pumping station. In a report on the health of Leeds in 1865, Dr. Hunter, the medical officer for the Privy Council, noted that it is certain that the River Wharfe receives large and constantly increasing quantities of filth. This, as well as the continued costs associated with pumping water, led the corporation to think again. In 1866, a report to the Waterworks Committee from the borough engineer Edward Philliter outlined 4 possible sources for a new supply: the River Nid, the River Yure, the rivers Burn and Laver, and the River Washburn. On account of the quantity and quality of water available, as well as being closest to Leeds, the Washburn was chosen. Leeds secured powers in 1867 to build 4 reservoirs in the area. Lindley Wood, which was a compensation reservoir, Swinsty, which was a service reservoir, Fewston, and Thrushcross, which were both storage reservoirs. Although Phillota was the father of the scheme, he was aided by the eminent water engineer Thomas Hawksley, who came on board as lead engineer in 1867. The reservoirs took 10 years to build, and problems were encountered along the way. Cracks in the land and landslips slowed work at Lindley Wood and Swinsty, as did a large outbreak of smallpox amongst the navvy workers. Towards the middle of the 1870s, it was becoming clear that the scheme was taking longer and costing much more than expected. A compromise was reached then. The construction of Thrushcross would be postponed and held in reserve should Leeds need to increase its water capacity, and extension work would be undertaken instead at Eckup. Despite these issues, though, the scheme was a success. At the completion of Fewston Reservoir in 1879, Thomas Hawksley proclaimed, with a touch of boosterism, of course, that Leeds was in possession of one of the finest, if not the very finest, waterworks in the United Kingdom. The completion of the construction in the Washburn Valley did not end Leeds' involvement in the valley, as the reservoirs had a number of impacts. Land subsidence in 1880 made the village of Fewston practically uninhabitable. While the land was prone to subside in the area, it can be no coincidence that a subsidence of this scale occurred less than 1 year after the completion of the reservoir scheme. Afforestation was undertaken in the early 1900s as a way to try and combat pollution of the watershed. The corporation utilised unemployed men to do the work, but they did not give them the tools or the training needed or the pay to make the scheme a success. The project was deemed a failure 4 years after it started, with much of the blame placed on the unemployed. And thereafter, afforestation was undertaken by properly trained foresters. But there were positive impacts too, and it's important to recognise this. The area became associated with leisure for Leeds residents, with fishing and rambling successfully established in the valley. The reservoirs, looking like natural lakes as they do, were deemed to have improved the beauty of the area. Newspapers and guidebooks started calling the area the Leeds Lake District, a very deliberate choice of words with all of the associations that brought. And while there were undoubted shocks to the local community, their relationship with the corporation ultimately improved and prospered in the 20th century, seen in the support from the corporation, both moral and financial, to the annual Washburn Valley Tenant Farmers Association show. The Washburn supply was a success for Leeds, certainly, but as the city grew, more water was eventually needed. A scheme to tap waters from the Burn and Laver near Massam was undertaken in the early 20th century. That was one of the schemes that Phillota had originally pointed to in 1866. Now there's a whole other story here, but essentially due to engineering and municipal mishaps, only one reservoir at Leighton was constructed, as the ground in the area was recognised to be completely unsuitable for construction. Leighton was finished in the interwar period and certainly helped Leeds to deal with the droughts of the 1930s. By the 1950s, though, Leeds was yet again in need of more water. The post-war industrial boom, plus the severe droughts of the 1950s, had put the city's supply under pressure once again. Due to the aforementioned issues on the rivers Burn and Laver, the corporation returned to the Washburn Valley to finish what Phillota had started roughly 100 years previously. Now, a number of things had changed since Phillota's day, of course. Most obviously, there had been advances in engineering and technology. Unlike the other 3 reservoirs in the Washburn Valley that was sunken into the ground and made to look like natural lakes, Thrushcross was built by using explosives to create a small valley, which we can see in the picture on the left here, and then filled in with a concrete dam. its bright white wall symbolising a more modernist approach to rural architecture. The reservoir was also larger than the one that had been planned in the 1860s originally, which led to the flooding of West End Village. Now, West End had largely been depopulated by this point, although there were some people living there. The threat of dam construction that had been looming for decades over the village meant that those affected in the valley did not really respond in protest, as in the case of other flooded villages in this period, most famously Treveyan Reservoir in Wales. But providing more water to Leeds undoubtedly had further impact on life in the Washburn Valley. Those that did live in West End were forced to move, while a church and burial ground was also forced to be relocated. To supply water to Leeds has been an ongoing process for a number of centuries. As population and industrial production increased during the 19th and 20th centuries, it's not surprising that this process intensified in these 2 centuries. On the whole, the efforts of the Leeds Corporation were successful in bringing good quality water into the city. It's important to recognise, though, that these efforts had short and long-term impacts, some of which were good and some of which were bad. Knowing a bit more about how Leeds got its water can help us to see the relationship between the city and the country a little bit more clearly. I hope you've enjoyed this talk today, and thank you very much for listening.